South Africa's foreign policy can be best described as ambiguous and at worst as in contravention to universal human rights. We argue for neutrality in the war in Ukraine, but we entertain naval exercises with Russia and China. Our constitution recognizes human rights as a fundamental principle of our foreign policy regime, but we have embedded relations with Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, China, and Russia. On the other hand, our economy mirrors our entrenched relations with the European Union and the United States. In the same week that the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov visited South Africa to affirm political affinities with Pretoria, Janet Yellen, the American Secretary of the Treasury, visited sites of direct foreign investment in our manufacturing industry. When you sit in London, Washington, and Moscow, looking in the direction of Pretoria, what do we see? Who are we? What do you see from a foreign perspective? John?
Well, I think I need to take you back 30 years to the period running up to the election of 1994 in South Africa, when the Western world in particular, but I think the world in general, was absolutely convinced that South Africa was going to be a disaster, that everything was going to go wrong, that there was going to be a major civil war breaking out. I was fortunate enough to be the BBC correspondent that covered that election. I'm in charge of the coverage of it. Having been the BBC correspondent in South Africa in 1976 and 77, the real height of apartheid and of course the major challenge of the Soweto uprising. And of course, what happened was a political miracle, perhaps more than a political miracle. And that has set the tone for the way in which the West in general and the Americans, I think, and particularly the British, have seen South Africa ever since. It established a kind of benchmark for political common sense and decency and movement forward. And when that sadly started to unravel, as it has done to a certain extent, not I think as much as many South Africans themselves feel that it has unraveled, people in the outside world, especially in the Western world, didn't really want to know about it. We wanted to close our eyes to the apparent failures and still remember how 1994 was a political miracle, something we could really admire and like and approve of. And so now when we see these things, they feed, of course, into in some parts of British and American thinking, into that sort of post-colonial trope that, of course, it's going to break down. You know, naturally, this is what happens. I mean, that's been a familiar tone to some discussion of South Africa, and South Africa's friends, who are very, very many, are just kind of silenced by it, and we find ourselves making constant excuses in different ways. Yes, we say South Africa seems to be drifting into the zone of influence of Russia and China, and we evidence, of course, the naval maneuvers and the various that trip by Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, which was a remarkable exercise in in lies and inadequacies of different kinds. But we tend to say, of course, South Africa is a member of a group which includes Russia and China. Of course, it can't just simply turn its back on its friends. But there's a real fear, I think, among people who know South Africa and know the outside world, that South Africa is slipping away into the control, really, of the Chinese and the Russians who will come in and do what they've done in so many other countries in Africa, apart from anywhere else, and start to use South Africa's economic weakness in order to try to grab greater political and economic support from it. So that's something which worries a great many people. And when we look at the issue of, for instance, of load shedding, we see the way. Sorry, I'm getting some background. No, I thought somebody was trying to speak. When we see these things, some of us avert our eyes because we don't want to see South Africa in pain and suffering. And others, of course, will say, well, this is what you get for slipping into China's and Russia's orbit. Of course, nothing to do with any of that at all, although you could say that it does represent a lack of kind of self-confidence in the South African government to allow itself to mismanage things in the way that it has, and to allow itself to ignore its natural friends in the West in many ways. I think the real problem that South Africa increasingly has is to show a degree of competence. We see it in the business aspect of South Africa, which is still a vibrant economy, and which has an impressive track record of how to operate under sometimes difficult circumstances. South Africa is still seen as a kind of success story, and these other aspects to it are nibbling away around the edges, and will nibble away much more as time goes on if President Ramaphosa can't do something about it. But it's really an issue of the confidence that the outside world has in South Africa, and increasing its dependence on countries which don't, in the Western view, have South Africa's interests at heart, is going to enhance that sensibility. We have to I think in the West we have to understand what's going on in South Africa much more. Before I came on this morning, I looked through all the British newspapers for coverage of the State of the Nation speech, and that embarrassing business where the EFF members stormed onto the platform and so on. Always looks appalling, of course, to outsiders when things like that happen. The remarkable thing was that how few British newspapers and American newspapers have covered the speech last night. Very few of them. The Guardian, which has a record of supporting South Africa over decades, didn't mention any of it this morning, and it's still not there on its website. Nobody reported it for The Guardian. The Times newspaper covered it, and covered it actually rather well, if briefly. The BBC covered it because the BBC does cover South Africa rather effectively. A newspaper like the Daily Mail, which is often pretty trivial, but nevertheless has an extraordinarily wide range of coverage of South Africa, apart from anywhere else, doesn't mention it. Why doesn't it? Why don't those newspapers cover this? Well, I suspect it is because there's a certain sense that South Africa solved its problems in 1994, and these are just small scale things that are happening around the edges of a central success. Sadly, as a great lover of South Africa, somebody that goes there regularly, I try to go at least twice a year to South Africa. I don't think that is an accurate assessment, and I think that these things are starting to eat into the kind of heart of South Africa's effectiveness as a nation. And it's clear that President Ramaphosa, whom I've met and whom I admire, simply doesn't have the political clout to be able to stop these things. And I would say that turning to Chinese or Russian help is simply going to make the problem a great deal worse as the months and years go past. So at the moment, we've got bad headlines in most countries of the world, or that choose to be interested in it. The load shedding is a disastrous example of bad stewardship of the economy, which dates right back to the last days of apartheid. The issue of naval exercises, I think, is going to be quite humiliating for South Africa, with, as I understand it, only one ship able to take part in these exercises. It's just going to look as though other great powers are marching in and taking advantage of South Africa. And I think, I mean, it's easy for as an outsider to say these things, but it does, the central part of it needs to come, the central part of a solution to these problems needs to come from a much greater sense of self-confidence and a much greater political ability to kind of avoid that sense that the place is falling apart and that political parties are growing within the state who want to pull down the tradition that the ANC has established over the years since 1994. So yes, there's criticism, a lot of criticism in the West of the way that the ANC has run things. But basically, it comes, I would say, from a sense of disappointment that the miracle hasn't been able to charge itself up and continue over the years.
John, there's something else I would like to ask you, what I found particularly curious, and I hate it when South Africans do it, but you're from outside of South Africa, so I can ask you this. We have 44% unemployment in South Africa. 70% of people live in relative poverty in this country. We have some parts a completely absent state and at parts a really corrupt state. We have a massively corrupt, informal political economy in South Africa. All the ingredients that one would expect preceding a civil war seems to prevail somewhere in on that interface between civil society and the state. And still we don't see any sign of that. We expect the economy to go over the cliff. We expect a complete deterioration in the capacity of the state to really take care of society in any meaningful way. But I don't see any sign of a civil war. And I do take into consideration what has happened in July 2021 when we had massive looting and arson in KwaZulu-Natal and parts of Gauteng. Still, I don't see the dynamics of a civil war in South Africa. But you're almost a veteran of civil wars and covering with civil wars in the media. Why is it that in South Africa, in spite of the conditions prevailing, there's no evidence of a civil war?
Well, I think it's one of the magnificent things about South Africa that you're absolutely right about that. And in the experience of most Westerners, French people, Germans, British, Americans, who go still in large numbers to South Africa as tourists, they may have read these bad headlines, but when they go to Cape Town, when they go to the Garden Route, when they go to Johannesburg, they see a society which seems to be almost first world. If you don't look beyond the kind of places, the areas that tourists go to, and so it's very familiar to me that to hear people saying, you hear all these stories about South Africa, still seems to be absolutely, in charge of itself and calm and everything. I think you have to say, and these are sort of vague and kind of slightly disturbing areas, which I don't think it's very good to go deeply into. But I think it's something to do with the spirit of the country, which is still there. This is what I meant by saying that, South Africa's friends still have 1994 in their minds, the calmness, the basic gentleness and friendliness of people, the sense that there are social structures, that there are lines over which you shouldn't tread. And I think it's this sort of misty qualities of the national character that keep South Africa from falling over the cliff that you're talking about. I mean, you go to another country, you go to Nigeria, for instance, which is a country I also know well and love, but there's a sort of an upheaval in the daily lives of everybody, which make it as though it constantly is in a sort of state of civil war of one form or another. And the whole religious issue and the issue of Islamic fundamentalism and so on, all of these things have a powerful effect to kind of destabilize Nigeria. These things don't apply in South Africa, and there is that sense of stability which every visitor to the country finds. And when you go to the townships, when you go to big townships like Soweto, or small ones like the ones that I've visited so often, you find that same friendly helpfulness. You don't find the sort of atmosphere that you do, for instance, in Congo or somewhere like that, where there's a bitterness and an anger which can flare up at any moment. And I think that's another reason to be grateful for South Africa and for the example that it's still setting.
John, thank you very much for your expert and experienced view there. If you want to stay around, please do so. I'm going to continue with my other guests talking about the SONA South Africa. Kaya Sithole, you've heard what John said. He alluded to the status of the president and the sense of say, disappointment almost with his ability to formulate policy and to follow through on it. There's a measurable sense of skepticism among South Africa about Cyril Ramaphosa. Many people simply don't believe the undertakings of the president anymore. Why is it that it seems that he seems to be impotent in the face of the urgent needs for change in renewal in South Africa, because he says the right things. But let me give you an example. I've listened to young Ramaphosa recently. He said that the president invited him to his office. With the president was Betty Mantashe and Minister Pravin Gordhan. The three of them, the three most influential politicians, were in the room with Jan Ramaphosa. That was 3 years ago. They asked him, Jan, what is wrong and what can we do to fix this? And Jan gave a broad explanation of what is required. Much of what is in policy nowadays. But Jan says not one of the suggestions came to fruition. And 3 years later, we're exactly where we've been 3 years ago. Kaya, what is going on?
Good afternoon to everyone. I think the great tragedy is that President Cyril Ramaphosa has come into this particular role, has come into this particular position as a man who had a primary fixation of fixing the ANC, because obviously it was the ANC that elevated him. And in his fixation to fix the ANC, he has literally allowed the state to essentially drift. And that sense of drift we can see in many of the key portfolios that you mentioned, for example, where you then have to ask yourself the question, his first State of the Nation address was on Valentine's Day in 2018. So he's done a whole lot of these over a period of 5 years. And yet, whenever he speaks, we are left with more questions rather than confirmation. So we keep asking, well, what are the issues of the day and how are you resolving them? And I think for me, that reflects the fact that, unfortunately, the ANC government at large just quite simply doesn't have the skills or the capacity to run a state of this nature. They don't know how to run a developmental state. They don't know how to run state-owned enterprises. And what we are seeing now is that they're essentially becoming a meaningless government. They are retreating from running a lot of the main issues that we need to deal with. And I think what that reflects is the fact that, look, for him coming into a party that he needed to try and unite in order for him to validate his existence as the party leader simply meant that he didn't pay as much attention that he needed to pay into running state affairs. And what we're now seeing is that, unfortunately, a lot of what the ANC has done over the past 25 years is now essentially coming back to bite them. Because whether you look at the cadre deployment policy or whether you look at their inability to look for the long term and invest in the long term, we're now seeing the consequences of that. So it becomes a very difficult country to lead. It becomes a very difficult party to lead. And I think Mr. Ramaphosa, in his capacity, is a person who is struggling to run not only the party, but the state at large.
Look, we have another 18 months left before there's an election. 18 months of ANC government. Are you giving up on the ability to renew, to change the things that the president said he would like to do to put South Africa on a new growth path? Is it impossible for the ANC to make the economy grow and to stabilize the South African politics?
I honestly do not believe that the ANC in its current formulation and its current configuration can deliver on those particular promises. And the reason I say that is that when we look back and we try to analyze how we ended up with some of these particular problems, it's the way the ANC runs itself as a party and the way the ANC believes the state ought to be run that are the fundamental issues. So, for example, if the ANC were to discover tomorrow that I am the best person to run a state-owned enterprise or a state utility, for example, that wouldn't be the reason they hire me. Their first question would be, am I loyal to the party? And what that has done is that it has limited, the pool of people who can be deployed into these critical positions. So I do not believe that there isn't a single person out there in the country who knows how to run Eskom or Transnet. It's simply the fact that a lot of us simply sit out the process because you know that, well, at some point in time, the question will be raised about how loyal you are to the party, how close you are to the party. And if you're not close enough, then you're not going to get appointed. And that, unfortunately, has meant that by them limiting the pool of people who are appointable, they have essentially led themselves to only picking from a very, 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 very shallow pool of individuals. So people who could run the state enterprises properly are not being considered on the basis that they don't have political party affiliation. And I think that's a great disappointment of how the ANC has done things, because as a party that says that we're trying to deal with all the historical inequalities and the historical issues of exclusion, it cannot simultaneously become a party that then says, oh no, actually we've got to practice exclusion in XYZ, whether it's in the people that we deploy or the people that are appointed, because it's a contradiction. And it's not only is it a contradiction, but it's becoming costly, not only to the country at large, but to the ANC itself, because now it is facing a real prospect of losing an entire general election on the basis that it cannot even manage a single particular energy utility. So that is essentially the chickens coming home to roost, in my view.
David, we've been listening now to a rather depressing story from our first two guests, but let me ask you, you've listened to the speech last night, the Sona speech. Tell me, what in that speech encouraged you? What are they doing right? There must be something there that the president said that say, okay, good, this is something we can work with. Just give me those things that you think that can be followed through on.
Yes, good afternoon to everybody. I think there's one thing that the president said is a small thing, but I think he can really capitalize on that. But he didn't spend enough time on that, and that is that they're going to put an effort into transferring property deeds to poor people. Now, that sounds like something small. There's something really, it's not a major thing, not for a state of the nation, but I think that is quite significant because there are many millions of people in South Africa that live in property that they do not own. And I think that the president could have put much more effort, or much more emphasis on that specific thing that they're planning to do. In fact, there are many organizations actively trying to transfer people to individuals. That certainly, without a doubt, is a positive. And I think that's something that the president could have said much more about. Of course, there are many other things that the president also mentioned that are important, like, for example, to try to get the local authorities to work again. But the reason why the local authorities are not working is mostly because of the incompetence of the ANC government. The expanded works on waterworks, for example, those are all kind of things that we certainly need in South Africa. But it's really difficult to get a positive message from the president. The president spoke for far too long. He's trying to cover too many things. We've heard too many of these things before. So I'm afraid what the president needs to do is just get confidence back in him as a leader, in the government as well, and there's simply not confidence. I'm afraid to say what we've heard last night is a swan song of a dying party. This is the beginning of the end of the ANC, and good for South Africa.
But David, let me just stay with you for a moment. Don't we have to read between the lines as well? In the same breath, the president told us about the opening up of the corridor, the Transnet corridor between Johannesburg and Durban. At the same time, we heard that he will appoint the energy minister in his office, which will, on all likeliness, be a technocrat rather than a politician.
Yeah.
There are some things that I think that moves the ideology a bit somewhere, isn't it?
No, I disagree with you. Let's the second point you're making about electricity, for example. So we're going to get an electricity minister now, but we have a minister of state on enterprises. We have a minister of energy. We've got the deputy president that's supposed to be responsible for energy. We've got an energy committee. So they are just, everybody is responsible for electricity in South Africa. That means nobody is responsible for electricity. And as far as electricity is concerned, the important, the very dangerous, or the very difficult thing politically for the president to do is to really address the main issues at Eskom. And the main issues are they're spending too much money on the wrong kind of things, which means there are too many people, the wrong kind of people working at Eskom. You need to fire them. And he's just not prepared to go there. The second one is that you have to do something about the revenue of Eskom, which means that the local authorities must start paying for Eskom. And the president actually said not too long ago that Soweto should be exempted, or the debt of what should be written off for. So those are the issues. There's no financial plan for Eskom. Eskom is not going to work. This is not a solution for Eskom. Your first point about the corridor between Johannesburg and Durban, it's not a policy change. It's not an ideological change. It's simply because nothing else worked. So they've tried everything. Everything has been a disaster, and now the only thing that is left is to get the private sector to participate.
I don't care how they get to it, but you must admit privatization of schools, health services in South Africa, the fact that certain services in South Africa taken over the private sector is a shift in ideology because government actually allows that to happen.
No, it's not a shift in ideology. It's a practical shift. It's happening because government has collapsed in terms of their ideology. They do not have an ideology anymore. They're certainly not following their own ideology. The policies that there's no change in policy. What is happening is government is making use of the private sector. They're inviting the private sector in because there is no alternative anymore. In a way, this is a backdoor way of privatization in South Africa. We've privatized many.
But it's private. Okay, good. Oscar, what difference will a state of disaster make to our energy crisis? I think you're a bit closer to the ANC than anybody else around here. What difference will this state of disaster that the president announced last night, what difference will it make to our energy crisis, Oscar?
Acceptable answer is Oscar is none.
Okay, let Oscar tell us about that.
No, I think what the state of disaster allows is for government to obviously be in a position to, one, make additional funding available. So Treasury will play a part, whether that funding is to buy diesel to keep the turbines going in the short to medium term. It's something that Treasury has been reluctant to do. Secondly, in terms of bid window 6 and alternative energies, the president alluded to the fact that there is a number of regulations and red tape that stands in the way, and a state of disaster does mean that government can sidestep some of those regulations and things to try and expedite the provision of additional capacity. And also, secondly, where organized labor might want to stamp the authority. You saw the president of COSATU saying that they were not consulted about the state of disaster, but the state of disaster does also give government a number of mechanisms to deal with organized labor if they should want to become a problem with expediting certain things within the sector. So I think it's a strategic move. I know that there are concerns, of course, about the last state of disaster and people exploiting it. I think that's why the president has said that the Auditor General's office is going to be active within this period to look at expenditure and so on. And of course, we shouldn't forget, as was the case with the COVID pandemic, the Fusion Center, which is the law enforcement agencies all together, I think they will also play their part in trying to minimize any form of corruption or the misuse of funds in this period of the state of disaster. So I'm a bit surprised that the DA leader, Steenhuisen, was having a problem with this being declared a state of disaster, because it has been 14 years, 18 CEOs. It seems Eskom and the government is not able to solve this problem. And so I'm not surprised.
Oscar, I'm no fan of John Steenhuisen, but let me just tell you one thing. I think he's right when he says you don't need a state of disaster for anything that you've mentioned now. You don't need a state of disaster for that. I'll get to you now, Darby. You don't need a state of disaster for this. None of this that you've mentioned, you need a state. And by the way, the idea that you can circumvent laws or avoid laws in an effort to address our energy issues, it's not possible. I've spoken to Pierre de Vos, Professor Pierre de Vos at UCT. He said it is not true. It's a myth that you can circumvent the legislation in an effort to do certain things in a state of disaster. With all the help in the world, I can't find a reason for the state of disaster. What will it change?
Well, I mean, it's obviously a debatable point, but the point is that I think government is trying to find a mechanism to try and fast track certain solutions, especially the Treasury issue. I mean, obviously, the president could give an instruction, but Treasury could also push back in terms of the taxpayer. But I would imagine this is why they came with the state of disaster.
I want to get to you now, but let me just hear what Darby said, because I see there's a sense of urgency with him.
Yeah, no. What I wanted to say, we have to understand that we're in crisis here. This is a major crisis. The economy is not going to grow. We've got high levels of unemployment and poverty. Treasury is actually warning us that there are some trouble potentially on its way in South Africa. So we have to understand that this is a major crisis. But a state of disaster, I think, and I'm not a legal expert here, I think there's a sense of urgency if you declare something like a state of a disaster. But what I would have preferred is something like business rescue, because that is where Eskom is supposed to be going. You have to put Eskom under business rescue, and you have to save what can be saved, and you have to protect it potentially from creditors, as an example, and also from labor, by the way. So I understand the rationale behind it, that say there's something urgent that needs to happen, but I would have preferred something like business rescue as an example.
Kyle, just help me out with this, the new minister in the presidency that will, to a certain degree, bypass, I think, probably Gordon's department as well as that of Gary Tush. Is that a political expediency move of the president in an effort to avoid the conflict between those departments, which is ongoing now for months? Or do you really think that individual will make a difference?
Look, I think for a lot of us who've been speculating about how he's going to manage the civil war that exists between the Minister of Public Enterprises and the Minister of Minerals and Energy, because clearly Gwene Mantashe really shares the view that he is the person who can sort out load shedding within a much shorter time frame. So he's been making these public pronouncements that give the impression that he believes that only if Eskom was under his control would the load shedding crisis end. And of course, Pravin Gordhan has been in charge of Eskom for the past 5 years, and he hasn't managed to sort out that particular crisis. And so what we were expecting to see was a question of how will the president actually navigate that particular civil war, because those two still are his primary foot soldiers. They are among his staunchest and his most loyal, cadres within the political party. So they're not the type of people that you can essentially sidestep and think there are no consequences. So what he has done is that it's formulated an elegant solution to say, look, let us perhaps have this particular energy crisis reporting to the president himself, because then none of them can feel that they were prioritized over another. So he was managing the political war. The worry, unfortunately, is that in instances where the president has then said that, look, I'm moving particular a reference point or particular, decision points to the presidency, it hasn't always worked out. So we remember last year when I think a couple of years ago, when he then moved the State Security Agency to report to him, we don't actually see what the benefit of that has been. We know that there's an infrastructure oversight part in the presidency that is overseen by Ramaphosa. We actually don't see what that has led to. So unfortunately, when things then get moved to the presidency, it then becomes very difficult to sort of objectively assess them on the basis that this is their mandate and this is what they need to do, because it's not a very clear mandate. Are they reporting to the president or are they reporting to a minister? And that, for me, creates the type of tension points that are untenable. But I do think that if you look at last year, for example, where he said that he had appointed Sipho Nkosi to be the person responsible for taking the red tape in relation to small businesses. Sipho Nkosi, I'm happy to tell you that has only made one public statement in the 12 months since he was appointed, and it was at a birthday party of one of his friends. So we actually can't see what he has done. We actually do not know whether small businesses feel 12 months later that, look, something has been done to make their compliance processes a bit easier. In fact, what the CIPC did a few weeks ago was the exact opposite of that, where they made the process of complying for small businesses even more cumbersome. So you then have to ask yourself the question then, what happens when the president then says that, look, I want this particular portfolio to report to me in the presidency, because the history or the recent evidence that we have in front of us is that we never get to hear about them as soon as they get them. Even the Climate Commission, we now know that the man who was leading it, Daniel Minele, is leaving, but we actually do not know what they've achieved ever since Glasgow happened 2 years ago.
John Simpson, should that concern us that if the president, when the Ministry of Women didn't work well, he put it in his office. When state security didn't function well, he put it in his office. Now that energy doesn't function well, he puts it in his office. There's a concentration of authority and power in the president's office. I don't mind to a certain degree if he takes control of these departments, unless he uses it for authoritarian purposes, or he's avoiding managing the departments and managing his cabinet.
No, there's a concentration of the definition of roles. There's not a concentration of responsibility, because even if you look at how the State Security Agency was managed, it was a matter of, it used to be a standalone entity with a particular minister, with a particular director general, and then the president that is going to say it's going to report to the presidency. We do not know whether that means that there's a minister accountable for why the SABC, for example, doesn't have a board 100 days after Parliament said these are the candidates, because the State Security Agency says that, oh, sorry, we don't have the capacity or the resources to vet these people. So unfortunately, when it then moves things to the presidency, it actually breaks down the lines of accountability, because when do you actually hold them accountable? Is it when Modli Gungubele shows up in the Parliament because now he's got this vast portfolio where he's looking at some media assets and then he's looking at the State Security Agency? So all of those particular things make it very difficult to actually know where the lines of accountability lie. I actually do not even know whether the portfolio committee on the Department of Monitoring and Evaluation actually knows what to ask, because there's so many things that have been ascribed or allocated to a particular department, but in reality, it's very difficult to reconcile how social development, State Security Agency, and now the electricity minister are going to be able to talk to each other when they're housed in that particular part of the union buildings.
John Simpson, just help me out here. If you look from the outside and you look at this concentration in the presidency, is that something South Africa should be really concerned about?
Well, I think really the thing that South Africa has to be most concerned about is that appearance of weakness of the presidency. So if the presidency is indeed assembling greater powers, that could be a sign that it's realized its weakness and its needs to reinforce itself and, you know, just kind of look a little bit stronger on the domestic and the international stage. That's been the weakness. I mean, we had a number of we've had now a number of presidencies in the first stage, in the afterglow of Nelson Mandela, and then all of that coming to a total full stop with Jacob Zuma, who seemed to the outside world to be solely concerned with enriching himself and his friends. And you know, it looks from an outside perspective as though we're trying to kind of put the pieces together a little bit, and it's really quite hard for a presidency which has become so weakened to show itself as the dominant force again. And I think that's what Cyril Ramaphosa has as his major issue, the problem of establishing his authority over a country which is, you know, frankly, pretty critical of the way that the ANC is operated.
Oscar van Heerden, the president last night mentioned local government as an area of concern. It's bleeding resources at local government level. It's assassinations is rife in KwaZulu-Natal and in Mpumalanga at local government level. It is really, really the soft underbelly of South Africa. The president is concerned about it. Is there anything that you see that he's doing about it that can change that concern?
No. I mean, there's talk of the district model, which, as we know, is something that they've tried before, even though they don't say it. It hasn't worked. They don't have the answer to how they're going to solve the problem with municipalities. 163 municipalities out of 257 is in complete dysfunction. 57 billion rand owed to Eskom, presumably money that they've pocketed, that they've stolen. We all know that the mode of operations at municipality level, quite honestly, to a certain extent provincially as well and nationally, is by outsourcing to consultants. Civil servants are simply not doing their work. They don't have the skill sets, they are not competent, and all they are there to do is to line their pockets. So this is a massive, massive problem. And I don't see any viable plan of how the ANC is going to save the situation.
Let me just ask you something on that. I hope Helen Zille is not around, because I don't want to praise her for a moment unnecessarily. But if me and you, we were both at the ANC's leadership conference at Nasrec. If we take our binoculars and we look across the border to the Western Cape, and we see that the clean audits, we see the well-managed affluent areas and the well-managed middle-class areas, it must be possible to govern South Africa well. It can't be impossible to do it. We see areas where it is well governed.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not, maybe someone else must respond to the Western Cape, because being from this province, I mean, I know, for example, that the DA inherited a well-functioning province in the first place. The Discrimination and the Group Areas Act, etc., suggests that clinics, schools, universities, etc., for the so-called coloureds was already in a much better state and much more resources spent on that than in your TBV states where there were homelands and so forth. I mean, I don't want to go down history. What the DA has managed to do, to their credit, of course, in the Western Cape, is to maintain the status quo, keep the streets clean, maintain your areas and so forth. But there is no, ideologically, there is no incentive to try and get young people out of the Cape Flats areas and into Camps Bay. That is not part of the DA's agenda. And so they seem to be governing well. Even those clean audits, they get clean audits, it's true, but at the expense of not spending a lot of money that could have gone to poor households and poorer areas. But yeah, it doesn't mean that there can't be a situation where people govern properly. With all the flaws and faults, for example, in eThekwini, the municipality is at least showing some modicum of able to govern that city in a proper way. Joburg is a different kettle of fish altogether. As you know, the contestation is just way too much. But I think that there is a model that says that if you have ethical leaders and if you have competent leaders, you can actually govern properly.
Well, Oscar, you seem to be the right person to answer that question. Let me ask you, Dawie Rood. Usually the SONA tells us something about what the Minister of Finance will say on the, what is it, the 27th of February. What do you see in the budget? What have you seen last night that will reflect in the budget? Will our debt, for instance, go up? Will our spending go up?
Yeah.
Things like that. What have you seen last night that will be reflected in the budget?
A couple of things. I think I see Dr. Jamin ask a comment about fixed investment in South Africa and how the president keeps on talking about fixed investments in South Africa, but if you look at the actual data, it simply doesn't happen. We don't have enough fixed investment in South Africa, despite what the president is telling us every time. But a couple of things, like, for example, the subsidy for solar panels, I think that's not a clever idea. Don't use your tax system to get people to do stuff or not to do stuff. That's one. The president did mention that the Minister of Finance is going to take over some debt of Eskom. So how much, I don't know. As far as I'm concerned, you can just take you should take all the debt of Eskom. Very importantly, the president did mention that the grant system will continue. I think this will be the beginning of a so-called basic income grant kind of thing. Earlier the week, Mr. Kieswetter did indicate that he doesn't think that's a good idea to increase taxes. I don't think we're going to see substantial increases in the major taxes. There could be some small changes on the sin taxes and things like the fuel levy and so on, but I don't think the income taxes will be changed. So clearly what is happening in South Africa is that the demands on the fiscus simply keeps on going up and going up, while on the revenue side, there just isn't enough space to increase revenue substantially. That means inevitably that the deficit will remain quite large, and that means inevitably that the debt to GDP ratio will keep on going up. So the fiscal accounts in South Africa are not at a good place, and I'm afraid if the economic growth goes down to zero, where the South African Reserve Bank predicts it to be for this year, we will have a very small tax base to start off with, and we simply do not have economic activity to support this huge spending demands that are currently on the fiscus.
Ming, I hope I can get you on board here. Help me out here. When I first heard the president said that it makes sense to subsidize individual people who would like to invest in solar energy, I thought it's a fantastic idea. Dawie said it's a horrible idea to spend your tax money on that. What are your views on it? Azar, can you hear me?
I can.
Yes,
Can you
please.
hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, sir.
To be honest, the real problem I see is, given the constraints on the fiscus that Dawie referred to, the moment you start subsidizing things like that, where are you gonna get the additional money from to pay for that? And that's the kind of thing that concerns me. It concerns me that the whole question of solar, etc., is contributing towards more and more inequality in the country, because the people who are able to afford to bypass load shedding are precisely those who have the means to do so. So the underclass is left further and further behind by such a thing. To that extent, a subsidy might work, but my God, it's mind-boggling to think of how big a project this would be, and how the government could actually afford to bring about to subsidize such an exercise in the longer term. The same with subsidizing small businesses to cope with a problem. Yeah.
But don't the government lose a lot in taxes and income as long as this load shedding is continuing? The other thing is, if we can get the rich people to subsidize, or the rich people to put up solar, the poor people can get access to Eskom, which at the time is nobody have access to Eskom.
Absolutely. And what obviously wasn't mentioned was what has been introduced at the Western Cape, which I'm crying out to do because I've put solar myself, and there are times when I've got a surplus capacity of electricity, but I'm not allowed to. There's no mechanism yet for me to sell that back to Eskom to replenish the electricity capacity that they have. I mean, one could do that on a grand scale nationally and generate a hell of a lot of new electricity that way.
Kekla, last night you saw the start of that SONA, and we know 2024 is coming up. And a lot of people fear that a combination of the EFF and the ANC will eventually, in a coalition of parties, gain power again, and then we have the type of trade-offs that only the RET type of faction in South Africa can make with each other. What have you made of what has happened last night as far as the EFF is concerned, and the likeliness of a coalition in 2024? Because that's much what will be happening now in the next 18 months. What government will do, what the president will do, what will happen between political parties will be directed at the outcome of the elections in 2024.
Personally, I believe that that is where some of the hope lies in the country. I think the EFF probably shot itself in the foot with its antics yesterday. I don't believe it is gaining a huge amount of support. And the hope in the country lies in the fact that if the ANC loses its majority in 2024, you will see a complete realignment of politics in South Africa. And I asked in one of the webinars that you held last year, I asked Helen Ziller about this, and she said, well, the realignment will be based on the split between those who support market-oriented solutions to our problems and those who support populist and state interventionist solutions to the problem. And you could well have a complete realignment of politics in that way that can see a turning point in the decline of the South African economy.
Kaya, have we ended up in a situation where it's only possible, we only have the market economy left to save our political system?
Are you asking me or Darby?
Yeah. No, Kaya.
It's a very difficult one. And I think the reality is that we obviously know that the ANC historically has got particular loyalties, or at least believes in the Soviet style of control. Their alignment with communist-aligned organizations is something that defines their particular political ideology. But I think what has happened is that the ANC has struggled with the tension between having that type of commitment or that type of conviction to socialist ideologies, and also then having to manage an economy with very open market, market-oriented practices. And that inability to reconcile the two has meant that they've actually been left adrift. So, for example, if you look at how we opened up the skies and then we said, look, after apartheid, we actually want to have the skies opened, you cannot simultaneously have SAA operating as a very hamstrung monopoly, which is what it turned out to be. Because if you say to them that they have to comply with some of the state prescripts and their competitors are able to navigate much more freely within the market in order to be able to get a competitive advantage, it's inevitable that your own state enterprises are going to fail. We're seeing the same issues developing at Transnet. We're seeing the same issues developing at Eskom. So I think the ANC probably needs to be able to go back to its 1993 moment and say, but when we're talking through the eye of the needle, what exactly does the economy that we want to be able to run in order to be able to meet our social mandate, our developmental mandates, and also our economic imperatives look like? And I don't think they've ever got that recipe right.
John Simpson, you would like to add something to that discussion?
I would. I'd like to say I'm a complete outsider to this. I've been really impressed by the level of insights that I've been listening to. And I just want to say one thing to you, really, which is don't despair. I mean, a country which can produce speakers like you've got today with such clear insights into what is going on, with a spread of influence over the entire country, is something which is really to be praised and supported. South Africa has a good, under threat, but it still has a good judicial system. It's got an amazing degree of entrepreneurship, unlike anything anywhere else on the continent of Africa. It's got a kind of level of expectation about what governments should be like and what cities should be like and what townships should be like, how they should be run, which doesn't exist well, it scarcely exists anywhere else in Africa, where people expect their governments to rip them off and to control things in the interest of the few instead of the many. That's really important, that South Africa has this sense of itself, this sense of its identity, and this sense of where it ought to be, as opposed to where it is now. So you've got a vibrant press, you've got a vibrant academia, as I was saying. These are all qualities which keep, they're like a kind of life jacket that keep South Africa's head bobbing above the water. So don't please despair. You've got so much going for you. It's just a question of getting the right political system, which will, and the right kind of politics, which will enable these things to lift South Africa out of many, many of these problems. They'll never go away, but I think you've got the kit of parts there if you're able to use it. And as I say, if I lived in South Africa, and I wish I did in many ways, I'd probably be much more pessimistic and gloomy about it. But as somebody that does see it, does understand a little bit about its past and why it is doing what it does, I can tell you things are not as bad as you think.
Well, John, that's exactly why we had you here today, because sometimes we get a little bit close to the mountain and we tend to rely on the deep, dark scenarios to seek understanding of what we're doing. Thank you very, very much for being a participant today. David, always a pleasure to have you, always insightful. Oscar, my friend, thanks a lot for being around. Kaya, it's the first time. I hope it's not the last time we see you at the business school. Thank you very much to everybody. And Albert, unless you want to say something, it's goodbye for me.
For me, it's not the last time, because my niece is at the university, so I'll be engaging with the university.
Thank you very much. Yes, Pete, and all the speakers. It's a great honor having you here. All our participants, thank you very much. Our next PITSO will deal with, of course, with the budget. That will be on the 23rd of February, the same time, same place. I hope to see you there as well. Thank you very much.